Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers. In today's tutorial I'm going to be looking at altering materials to provide more evenly spaced textures and wear and tear in your materials. So let's get straight to it. It's been a little while since my last video, and that's for two reasons. First of all, I had a long holiday in Australia, and secondly, and more importantly to you, I've been working on the next version of my Simple Structures plugin. In fact, I can give you a sneak preview of some of the stuff I've been working on. If I go over here, the main feature I've been adding is multi-level structures. So if I select this building here, you can see that I can now have multiple levels, and it will generate all of the elements within if you want them, such as staircases, ceilings and roofs. So that's the main feature, but I'm also adding things like double back staircases and many other just ease of use features. So I'm about halfway through, and that version will hopefully be released pretty soon. Anyway, for today we're going to be looking at altering materials to get better looking textures. So if you want to follow on the way I'm doing it, you can download the Simple Structures plugin. The link is in the description below. You don't have to do it to follow along the video, but I've got a material in there that I'll be walking through to show you how I'm achieving all of the different elements. I'm going to start by explaining the sort of problems that you might come across when you're creating spline structures, and then how we address them. So with this first example here, I've dragged a wall into my level, and it's got two segments in the spline. And if I get close in, what you can see is that on one side of the spline point, the texture is very condensed. You can see these bricks are quite narrow, and on the other side they're stretched out. And the reason for that is because the way that I've developed this tool is that I want to make sure that I can always fit the mesh into the segment. So it tries not to stretch it more than 50%. So on the right hand side it's almost at the maximum. On the left hand side I've gone over 50% of the mesh length, so it's divided it by 2 and put 2 meshes in there. And because the standard material is using UV mapping, it's effectively stretching the texture or squishing the texture to fit into that mesh, hence the difference in size here. So how can you fix this so that you get even textures across the whole of your mesh? Well, there's a feature called World Align Textures, which allows you to project a texture onto your meshes so that it doesn't matter what length those meshes are. It will be uniform across the whole plane. So I have created a texture in the plugin as an example. So if you open up the Simple Structures content that's in the plugin and go to materials, you'll find this material here called Brick Wall WA, which stands for World Align. So if you double click on that, it's got various elements in it. The one I'm interested in is this world alignment here. It also allows you to do mix other textures in for variations or wear and tear, but we'll talk about that a little later on in the video. So for now you can see in my sample here that it's got the texture and some other texture wear and tear here. So let's get rid of the wear and tear for now and just talk about the world alignment. So go up to the noise mask, which randomly changes the variation. Click on it here, and if you change the function to simplex, and we'll make the scale 0, that will effectively make the noise not contribute to the material, and now we're just working with our regular wall textures. So if you now go back to the main section of the material, you can see that we're pulling in our textures, but instead of using a texture sample node, we're using a texture object node. That's the main difference here. And then from the texture object, you drag it to a world aligned node. So for the base color, you use a world aligned texture, plug your texture object in, and then plug the output to your base color. Don't worry about the lerp at the moment. We'll cover that later. And by using an XYZ texture, we're effectively projecting this texture onto the X, Y, and Z planes. So it gets projected onto both sides of the material and the top of the material as well. So this works really well for geometrically right-angled structures. So things like buildings, this is absolutely fine. But anything which has got curves and different angles, you'll probably find that the brickwork looks a bit odd. And I'll show you later what you might notice. So the diffuse goes into the world aligned texture. For normals, there's a special world aligned normal node. So again, the texture object for the normal goes into there, and the XYZ texture goes out into your normal. And then if you've got other packed textures like ambient occlusion, roughness, displacement, you can use the world aligned texture separate channels, and you plug your texture object in, and it's got separate outputs for your right red, green and blue channels. So the ambient occlusion here is going from there to the ambient occlusion. So let's see what that looks like if we apply that to the mesh. So let's go back here, choose the wall, and if I browse to the wall here, open it up, instead of using the brick wall instance here, I will use the brick wall world aligned instance and save that. I'm back here, and actually we haven't saved. If I go back to the world aligned here, I didn't actually save it. Okay. And now, if you look close up, there is no difference in scaling or stretching. So everything is uniform here. Effectively what it's doing is it's projecting the texture onto the plane. So if you want uniform textures, this is a great way of achieving it. It takes a little bit more processing power for the material, but in the scheme of things, it's probably within your budget. So what are the negatives of this approach? Well, one thing is that because it's projecting on there, it doesn't take into account any changes in the axes. So if, for example, we select this and let's go to snap to surface and turn that off. If I take this point here and raise it up, you can see that the brickwork is still going level here. So it's not following the contours of the brick wall, whereas the original UV based material would be stretched to fit and angled to fit that mesh. So if you want these sorts of spline shapes, then the world aligned texture's not the right approach. But if you are using standard planes, then this works really well. So that's world aligned textures. Let's now move on and talk about the variations in textures that you can add, for example, for wear and tear. So to add variations in your material and textures, you need other texture objects. So in the brick wall world aligned material that I've created, you can see that I've added some other textures. So if you look at the textures here, that's the brick wall with all the bricks in. I've also created one with a lot of bricks missing, and then I've created the associated normal and ambient roughness and displacement texture. So just like before, I'm plugging that texture object into the world aligned texture, and I want to have some means of switching between the standard texture and this wear and tear texture. So I'm using a lerp to alternate or to switch between those different textures. So I need something to control this lerp, and for this, if you look at the top of the material, I'm using this noise node. So what the noise node does is it just creates a mask of black and white within the material that you can then apply to switch between the textures. So if we preview this, you can see, in fact, we'll need to change the scale back. So let's change that back to 0.005. and you can see that I have a variety or a mixture of white and black randomly there. So because we're using plugging that into the lerp node down here in the alpha channel, wherever black appears, the first material will be shown, and wherever white appears, the second texture will be shown. So it's a way of creating that randomness. It's a bit fuzzy around the edges though, so I've added this cheap contrast node in, which hardens up the edges. So if I preview this, you can see that it creates a nice hard edge, and so those materials will effectively interpolate between them in a much more hard fashion. So let's remove that preview, and you can see, if we look at the preview here, that where the white appeared in the mask, our second texture appears, and where the black was, our first texture appears. So it creates that variation between the two textures. And let's just apply this, and then we can come back and look at what we can adjust. So let's save this and go back to the map, and you can see that we now have a wall with a variation of textures. It's got the main wall texture, and then where that noise mask changed the level, it basically adds in that second texture. So you could potentially have more than two textures, or you could choose the textures you wanted. So how do we adjust the amount of wear and tear, or the way it appears? Well, there's various noise parameters we can play with. So if you go back to the brick wall texture and go to the noise node, first one here is scale. So if you make the scale lower, it means that the areas are wider on the noise mask. So now if we go save that and go back, you can see that rather than having lots of smaller noise breakup, we have larger noise breakup in one area. So if you just wanted big blocks, then you can reduce the scale to get that. The other thing as well is you can change the amount of the breakup that you want as well. So if you go back here, you can see that we have this output minimum and maximum. So the lerp is only working between values of 0 and 1. So by putting -1 here, the first 50% of the noise that's generated has no impact on the lerp. So it favors the main texture more than, and then the randomness is applied to the second 50%. So if we change this output to 0 and save it, you can see that now we are not favoring the main texture as much. So you can change that. But to be honest, you can experiment with any of the different levels here and see what you get up with in the mask. You can always preview the mask here to see what it looks like. So you can see that's a much larger mask there. So play around with it and see what results you get. But in general, this technique for aligning your materials and applying noise masks can be used in a wide variety of circumstances. So have fun, and I will see you shortly in the next video. Bye for now.